Klaus just set the historical frame for us in terms of data and data science, and we'll now dig a few decades like more recent, and look into the development of the World Wide Web, as well as the development of the cookie being one of the key technologies for tracking in the previous decades. We will have Lou Montulli, an engineering legend. He was one of the founding engineers of Netscape in 1994 and is one of 6 inductees of the World Wide Web Hall of Fame among Tim Berners-Lee, the inventor of the World Wide Web, and Mark Andreessen, who invented the first browser with a graphical interface. Unfortunately, Lou could not be here with us today because time constraints and, time differences and flights and everything. So we actually sent last minute a camera crew to his house in sunny California and pre-recorded the whole thing. And it will be split into 2 parts. Lou will first talk about the invention of the cookie, and then tomorrow go more into the future of the cookie and tracking and data in general. Like I just said, Lou Montulli is an engineering legend, and he and his team are very well known for inventing the web cookie, the HTTP cookie, the blink tag, the server push, the client pull, HTTP proxying, as well as something that we use every day, the forms in the web. Initially, the cookie was thought to enable critical new features in the web while actually maintaining the privacy of user data. Eventually, the cookie was then misused and was one of the leading technologies for tracking in the end. And this is something that Lou will cover up in his talk, how the cookie was invented, what were the first initial ideas around it, how he also had multiple chances to stop the cookie for being used for tracking, but then decided not to. Like I said, there will be 2 parts. Right now, he will be sharing with us part 1, the invention of the cookie, and then tomorrow really uncover the truths about how he didn't stop the cookie being used for tracking, and also talk about the epic battle that he had to face between the open web in its early days and the walled gardens of AOL and Microsoft. Lou Montulli will present the inside narrative about the birth of the digital era, and with that, I want to say, welcome, Lou.
Hi, I'm Lou Montulli. I'm best known as the inventor of cookies. I'm here in Menlo Park, California, and I was also the inventor of the Lynx browser and a founding member of Netscape Communications. And happy to talk to you all about cookies and privacy today. So the scene as it unfolds is back in the very early 90s. I think I started working on an internet browser in either 1991 or 1992. It's a little hazy, a long time ago. And at the time, there was a lot of different internet protocols. The internet already existed, although there was really only academic users on it. And there was various protocols to access data, but it was very difficult to use. It was basically text only. You could type in commands and get back some stuff, but it was pretty boring for most people. The web browser was an attempt to make it, the internet, a lot more accessible, to put a nice user interface on top of something that everyone who used it thought was very useful. So the hope was browsers could bring the internet to the general populace. When I started working on this, I was in college, and I was a student, and almost everybody else working on early internet browsers was also a student, with the exception of Tim Berners-Lee, who was a researcher at CERN and had a big vision. And everybody else was students or graduate students who were really bored and looking for something to do and found this a fascinating project. So our core principles was open information, self-publishing. The formats should all be open and accessible to everyone. So everything we built was done in open standards way, and we were essentially giving that technology back to the world as we were developing it. Yeah, another core concept of the early folks I worked with on the browser was privacy should be a first principle, that one should be able to anonymously surf the internet if desired, and that you should not be able to be tracked across websites. Yeah, so in the mid-90s, the web started to really take off in terms of user adoption. And also around that time, there was a lot of talk about the information superhighway as publicized by Al Gore in the US. And there was a lot of both governmental funding going into, as well as commercial funding going into building online networks. At the time, there was two major commercial competitors. One was AOL, which I think everyone remembers from the You've Got Mail ads, and millions of DVDs or CDs sent out to every home, as well as MSN, which was Microsoft's attempt to create a worldwide network. And the difference between the commercial networks and the World Wide Web was the commercial networks were strictly controlled by single corporations, and the companies that would post content on those sites would pay to have access to the users, and the users would also pay to be on the site. So it was a marketplace network where both sides had to pay to be part of it. Those of us working on the web felt that what we were working on was what should be the true information superhighway, because it was not only a powerful platform that we thought we were building technologically, but it was also free and open. And it was based on the broader internet, which is also a open network where anyone can interconnect through a broad network, and it wasn't controlled by any one company. So it was about that time that we started the company Netscape, and I went there, as well as many of the folks from NCSA who had built the Mosaic browser. We also hired people from CERN in Europe, and basically anyone we could find who had worked on the early web browsers. We tried to bring all into one building and start working on a bigger, better version of a web browser. And we were a commercial company, but we were also founded under the principles that what we were going to build, we were going to, again, give away the underpinnings of the technology using open standards to make sure that everything we built was interoperable and that it was preserved for future generations. Shortly after the founding of Netscape, we started to work on a set of core features that would help enable e-commerce on the internet. And the thought was, if we enabled e-commerce, we would essentially create a revenue stream for the internet that would be sustainable. Because it's all well and good to have a set of technologies that allows anyone to freely surf the internet, but if there was not companies who actually provided information and provided businesses on the internet, then there would be no future funding, and the commercial networks that were competing with us, i.e. AOL and MSN, would essentially win out due to greater funding. And so part of that was security. So we started working on what was known as SSL, and is now TLS, and is the HTTPS protocol, as well as technologies that would enable online shopping. And one of the core technologies that we needed to create was some form of memory for the web, so that when a user came to a site and expressed some sort of preference, i.e. I wanted to buy something like a pair of blue suede shoes, that when they continued through the site would be able to remember what they wanted to purchase. There's also many other uses for memory. So for instance, just your login is one example of that. but many other examples where memory is very useful. So anytime you want to interact with a website where your preferences are remembered, some form of memory is really required. And the web in the early days had none of that. There was simply the ability to log into a site through username and password. And besides that, there was no other form of interaction that would allow a website to recognize a user from one visit to the next. And I'm not meaning just like between daily visits. I mean, each time you click on a link, it closes the connection to the server and reconnects to the server and so on and so forth. And each one of those looks anonymous to the server on the other end. And so cookies was the technology that we came up with to solve this. But cookies were complex in that they were attempting to simultaneously solve the data privacy problem while providing memory to individual websites. The actual creation of cookies was one particular moment, but the problem of memory on the web had been hashed and rehashed for years prior to that, because it was a known problem that we had yet to address. But all of the prior solutions that had been proposed essentially could be used as a tracking mechanism. So most of the mechanisms proposed were sort of like adding a unique identifier to each web browser, and that was clearly not something that we would want to provide, because we were very much against tracking and in favor of privacy and anonymity on the web. So the core concept of cookies and the eureka moment was, what if we just sandboxed them to only the relationship of a particular website? It's a little bit more complicated than that, because websites are not just run off a single host, and you have to address domain issues. And so we attempted to address that as well. But that was the eureka moment, was what if we just created a identifier that was only associated with individual websites and was not shared between websites. And then cookies were made a little bit broader in that they can store small bits of information rather than just a unique identifier. But the idea was really very similar to something I had learned in a operating systems course while still in college. And my memory, although I was never able to find the textbook that I thought I got this out of, was that this concept was called a cookie, or a magic cookie. And it's really akin to a fortune cookie, in which you have a message written into a cookie, or a fortune cookie, and then that is held by somebody, and then the cookie is returned back to that person, and the message is read at that point. It was definitely seen as a positive advancement that would solve the problem we had struggled with for a long time. So people were really happy with the technology. But I also say we were working on 10 new things that were all going to move the needle pretty substantially. And cookies at the time didn't seem like they were that any bigger than anything else. And they were certainly a lot easier to implement than something like SSL, which involved a whole new protocol layer and a lot of new encryption technology. And so it was widely discussed and vetted by the team for probably a week or two, in which we made subtle changes to make the cookie proposal more secure, and also add limits to it. But then it kind of quickly got buried under a lot of other things we're working on. So it was created, it was vetted, it was implemented, and then it was put to bed. And it wasn't really until a year later that the technology got widely adopted, because this was part of the initial development of the very first Netscape browser. It had to be released, and then it had to be adopted by the world into an actual server system. Yeah, so cookies didn't start being used for analytics until much later because, as I mentioned, cookies were designed not to allow for tracking, and analytics is a form of tracking. And so it wasn't until the affiliate technologies where using third-party cookies for an embedded image reference in addition to refer fields and or JavaScript, it's then that cookies were able to be used either for ad tracking or for analytics, which are both the similar use case, but slightly different sides of the tracking coin. In those early days, and still to this day, analytics were done just by looking at server logs. So when a user or any browser connects to your own server, you are able to log the transaction, and then one can look at your local server logs to see any analytics you want to see. It was only much later that tools like Google Analytics, which were a central repository that made analytics easy to collect for any website, came about. So around 1996, I became aware of the use of cookies in an ad tracking network called DoubleClick. And I think we found out about it from a news article, which was pretty surprising. Nobody had reported this prior. And my first thought was disbelief, because we had really engineered things and tried to design things to make sure that cookies couldn't be used in this way. It took a little bit of time to understand the problem, and it turns out that because of certainly something we could have foreseen in this case, because of the use of cookies for image references, which we call these third-party cookies now, in combination with some other technologies within HTTP, it definitely allows cookies to be used if a whole group of websites also essentially work together to create that network. So it's not something that can be applied by an attacker, for instance. So it's not a flaw that allows a single attacker on the web to then broadly track people. But it does allow a coordinated set of websites who all work together to create a tracking network of a sort. At the time, they weren't using it in a nefarious means. They were really, the ad company was just using it to track ad impressions, which was certainly what most people would consider a valid use of the technology. But it certainly brought into question how it could then be used for broader tracking if the companies wanted to do that. And then further down the line, as ad personalization grew, it did start to look a lot like tracking, because the ad tracking network started to collect preference data from the user's access to various websites and started to serve ads that track their preferences. So this definitely looks like tracking across the web, and it was definitely against the core principles of what cookies was designed for.